Gordhan told the State Capture Commission that he asked former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel to fund the formation of the unit. Now, the unit has been criticized as it was in contravention of the National Strategic Intelligence Act of 1994. Well, Advocate Dalimpofu was cross-examining the minister on behalf of Tom Moyane over allegations of state capture. Joining us now is Pauli journalist with the Daily Maverick. He's also the Scorpio investigative journalist with the Daily Maverick. I think it's important to get that particular naming convention right. Pauli, very good morning to you, and thanks for talking to us. I want to pick up on the point about the existence of the so-called rogue unit. And I want you to take us back to what the Newzroom Commission told us. What did that commission conclude around the so-called rogue unit?
Good morning, Pauli. Thank you for having me. So it's rather not an admittance as opposed to a restating of fact. We know since 2014, and actually before that there was a unit that went through a lot of name changes, but mostly named as the NRG unit, that investigated various like tobacco smuggling, smuggling of substances, and really high risk and difficult cases for SARS. Now, these people often were threatened, and SARS actually had to hire bodyguards for their families and themselves. So they were on the books in a way that they had a cost center. Their structure, I personally saw, were described in documents at meetings at SARS. SARS went so far as to hire them bodyguards. So there's no way to say that no one knew of these units. Now, just to take us back and to what you're specifically asking, the Sikhakhane report that investigated wrongdoing at SARS and with specifics to Johan van Lochenberg, who was the unit's head, accusations of a rogue unit or an illegal unit came only later. Now, that report has no standing anymore. The Sikhakhane report relied on KPMG and on information relayed from there, and KPMG retracted their report. They told the public that the information was manipulated by Tom Moyane's lawyers. It couldn't back up claims that they offered as fact. And the Newzroom Commission investigating wrongdoing at SARS contradicted that report. Now, the Newzroom Commission went through all the documents. They looked at how the unit in the first instance was set up. That unit and the setting up of it was under NIA and SARS. So it was a collaboration between the previous intelligence agency and SARS. Now, at the time, the intelligence agency went through managing changes and they lost appetite for such a unit. So SARS already sat with personnel, with a structure, with a costing, with funding. And they sat with documents that said that Trevor Manuel and Pravin Gordhan agreed that this unit is necessary. So what SARS then did was to alter what they were doing. They were starting to look at tobacco companies, at substances being smuggled, and they also looked at unfortunately for them, people who funded President Jacob Zuma without realizing that they were benefactors at the time, because this is before anyone really knew what the term state capture meant, what President Zuma's role in state capture was, and they found footprints of Edward Zuma. So that was on the one hand. And then Ivan Pillay also started to probe the president's tax affairs and try to make him tax compliant. And the president at the time got the idea that SARS was poking around. And from that flowed a series of events that now gave us a unit that's being accused as having done illegal things.
Yeah, and you've set that context very well. The big argument at State Capture yesterday was around this unit having existed and the admittance that, yes, it did exist, but the debate is about where it ought to have been housed. Now that NIA, the National Intelligence Agency, had lost appetite for it, it should not have existed, in particular within SARS, because SARS by law was not allowed to house such a unit, because as Dalimpofu read yesterday, that it ought to have existed either within the police service or the military or indeed the National Intelligence Agency. So the fact that it existed outside of the legal prescripts, does that not make it an illegal unit that would have existed at the time?
Just to take you back to your first sentence, it's actually supposed not to be the big fight yesterday. The big fight was actually supposed to be about, did Tomoyani support and further the state capture project? Also, when he laid criminal charges against Pravin Gordhan, that was later declined to be prosecuted by the NPA. It did, however, turn into a fight about the unit because Advocate Dalimpofu is very clever in the way of slipping in things that's already been disproved. He also has two dogs in this fight. The one is that his client is obviously Mr. Tomoyani, and the second is that the EFF had taken in a stance anti-Gordhan and therefore pro-supposed rogue unit, which is not true. Now, specific to your question is the fact that the Newzroom Commission again looked at the legislation. Now, the legislation or the assertions that Mr. Dalimpofu now tried to re-argue, and that was already argued in the Newzroom Commission, is that legislation prohibited SARS to do certain investigations, intelligence investigations. Now, Mr. Nugent said that is not so. SARS can have a certain capacity to use undercover means to look at some of the taxpayers. That's what they do. They can ask the court for subpoenas. They can set up certain investigative units. That part of investigating and covert investigation is not illegal per se. Now, what was illegal was when when the unit was supposed to be under NIA and under SARS, a collaboration between the two, and they used certain measures of using, for example, telecommunications in terms of listening into people's phone calls. Yeah. That they're supposed not to do, and that they didn't do when the unit was realigned to work legally under SARS.
So when they probed the president, Jacob Zuma, and you mentioned earlier that the footprints of Edward Zuma also came up, was that done legally?
Yes. Well, remember that they didn't probe Mr. Zuma. The SARS has a VIP unit that looks at judges, at politicians, at cabinet members, at the president, not in terms of criminal investigations, but rather in terms of helping people to become tax compliant. Now, that's different from a criminal investigation. It's more like helping people because they are at the top echelons of government and they're supposed to set an example. Now, Mr. Zuma didn't like it because on the one hand, suddenly his benefactors in the tobacco industry were being criminally investigated. His son was involved in some of those illegal doings by the tobacco companies. And now SARS and Ivan Pillay is coming and tell him that he needs to declare his additional income, he needs to declare his foundations. And now we, post-fact, separate from the SARS investigation, we already know that the Zuma Foundation do have problems. So clearly there was reason to look at those foundations. But anyway, so the president didn't like being asked about his tax affairs, also for good reason, we know now. So the perception with the president was that he was being probed, that his people were being probed, that his family was being probed. And that was a problem.
I want us to put to bed now about, in particular, the methods employed by this unit. We know now that it existed. I don't think that is in question. It's about, therefore, the methods that they used to collect whatever information they wanted, because let's again refresh. This was a unit that was meant to clamp down on illicit tobacco trade and other illicit trade within the country. But the issue here, Pauli van Wyk, it's about politicians, politicians' children, like you mentioned, Edward Zuma, and whether or not they were probed illegally. The methods used by this unit, now that we know that it was no longer, in fact, it hadn't been housed within the NIA, which it should have been, so it's within SARS, but the methods that they used to collect this information, was that above board?
So the methods the unit used was open source investigations, following certain casts, taking out certain warehouses and spaces, looking on the SARS database. So it was general SARS sleuthing. Now, what you referred to earlier about the National Prosecuting Authority was more towards allegations of bugging the National Prosecuting Authority. Now, that is again where assertions were bungled, and maybe one should start with saying, or not referring to this unit as a rogue unit, but rather a unit inside SARS that one must evaluate whether their conduct was illegal or illegal. Because if you say it's a rogue unit, you already made that decision. Now, the problem with that unit is that they had all this capability. Now, Andries Janse van Rensburg headed up that unit, but he also had a side business at the time, an extracurricular business that he declared to SARS, that he paid tax on. They knew of it, but he installed listening equipment. Now, the National Prosecuting Authority, and specifically Gary Nel, a prosecutor at the time, contracted him, and I saw the documents. It was a legal contract. Gary Nel was authorized to the prosecuting authority to do this. He got a budget for it and everything. So Gary Nel contracted Andries Janse van Rensburg to install camera equipment inside certain boardrooms and inside certain offices, because this was the time of Gary Nel prosecuting Mr. Jackie Salibi, the police commissioner of the SAPS.
Yeah.
Now, they thought that they were being looked at and that their conversations were being intercepted, and that someone came into their offices at night and stealing some of their documents. So they wanted to look at who it is. Now, Andries Janse van Rensburg had done that installation. But what he also did was to get information and transcribe it. And that he did give to Gary Nel, but he also gave it to Ivan Pauli. And from that issue, the NPA said that the information was not where it should have been. It wasn't supposed to be given to Ivan Pauli, and that this conduct spying on the NPA. Now, then the NPA, under Sean Abrams still, initiated charges against Ivan Pauli, Andries Janse van Rensburg, and strangely, Johan van Logrenberg. Now, Johan van Logrenberg didn't have anything to do with this situation that I just described, the alleged spying or installation of camera and CCTV equipment in the NPA, yet he was charged. Now, I looked at the entire docket of the NPA. It's very clear that they conflated two different investigations, that one of their targets was actually Gary Nel, that they also wanted to charge him, and that they conflated the facts of the two investigations and the two targets. That, for one, already came up to a bungling of an investigation. But they charged the men under PRECA, our Prevention and Combating Corrupt Activities Act, and then also Communication-Related Information Acts. They were charged under. And then under Shamila Batoy, the entire case, with all the witnesses, with all the assertions and facts, and the relevant legislation was reviewed. And Shamila Batoy decided and realized that there's no case, because there was a legal document, a legal instruction from the NPA, and that there's no case for charging Ivan Pauli, Andries Janse van Rensburg, and Johan van Logrenberg. So that is how it came to be, that there is no such thing as a rogue unit, that there were maybe questionable and ethical conduct on Andries Janse van Rensburg's behalf, but that it's not chargeable, it's not a criminal offense that can be charged in court. And Shamila Batoy made that decision and retracted all criminal charges.
Pauli, let's wrap up our discussion, and I want to ask of you this question. And we know now that this unit existed, and it existed within SARS. Might that not be an issue? In particular, if you listened carefully to Dalimpofu's line of questioning, because as you said, he cleverly tried to bring up the very same old conversation or argument that has been there for the longest time. But it now has the admission of the Minister Pravin Gordhan, who at the time was the SARS Commissioner. Might that be an issue going forward, that there is an admittance that the unit existed, but as to where it ought to have been housed, that then becomes a matter of legal contention, if you like?
I wouldn't call it inadmittance, because Gordhan's hand signature, as well as Trevor Manuel's signature, was on the document that birthed this unit. It is a well-trodden fact. It was a fact way back in the late 2000s. It's a fact in the early 2010s. It's still a fact. The unit existed. There's nothing to admit. And it was really well investigated by KPMG, by Sikakani, by the Newzroom Commission, and everyone said there's a unit. What they differed on was whether their conduct was illegal or rogue. And a part of that is obviously the point that you speak to, is are they housed in the right state-owned enterprise or entity? Now, Nugent then, Judge Nugent, who conducted this investigation, a commission into SARS, looked at all relevant legislation and could find no wrongdoing in terms of where this unit was housed. He said that the unit was necessary. He actually said that such a unit should be re-established, and that unit was pivotal in the investigation of certain hardcore criminals who do not play nice when they are told that you are behind with your tax and you should pay tax.
Yeah.
Hardcore criminals need a proper investigation. So, and remember that Judge Nugent and the Commission trumps any investigation by an advocate like Sikakani or by KPMG. KPMG anyway didn't stand by their assertions. They couldn't back it up and they retracted their report. The Sikakani report was never reviewed, but the information that it used was retracted by KPMG, so it has no standing. There's apparently review processes in court. And the Nugent report has not been reviewed. So yes, we have a very clever advocate in Advocate Dalimpofu, and that's his job. He's supposed to be very clever, but he can also be wrong, and he's wrong on this account.
Pauli van Wyk, thank you very much for putting us in the picture there of the goings-on, particularly around this issue of the unit that existed within SARS. Some call it a rogue unit, and some call it a unit that was necessary to probe illicit financial trade, whether it be cigarettes and what have you. Thank you so much, Pauli van Wyk.